Everyone. I'm Holly Blackburn Piper, and I'm a member of the Blackburn Advisory Board and the Blackburn Society. On my behalf of my family, I just wanted to welcome everyone to the closing session for the Gloria and John L. Blackburn Academic Symposium. And although Mother is not able to be with us today, she is here in spirit and she sends her best to each and every one of you. We've had an amazing group of presenters and panelists this weekend, and I really look forward to hearing from our closing keynote speaker in a few minutes. But first, I just wanted to say how great it's been to see so many students, fellows, advisory board members, and guests join us from across the state and from around the world. And together, we can strive to be that intergenerational community of ethical change agents that my father envisioned. My hope is that each of us will take away the information that we've learned from this weekend and work to improve Alabama and our home communities. I really appreciate your attendance today and for all of your support for the Blackburn Institute. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to our Blackburn student chairperson, Ariana Kellum, and she will introduce our closing keynote speaker. Thanks.
Good morning again, everyone. As we come to our final session of the day, I want to remind us of a question often asked by Dr. Blackburn. What have you done today? What have you done for our communities, for our state, and for our nation? The Blackburn Institute provides a vehicle for change, and our closing keynote speaker understands what it means to be called to action. An alumnus of Tougaloo College and South Texas College of Law, President Derrick Johnson is a veteran activist who has dedicated his career to defending the rights and improving the lives of Mississippians. As state president of the NAACP Mississippi State Conference, he led campaigns for voting rights and equitable education, spearheading 2 bond referendum campaigns in Jackson, Mississippi that brought $150 million in school building improvements and $65 million towards the construction of a new convention center. As a regional organizer at the Jackson-based nonprofit, Southern Eco Incorporated, Mr. Johnson provided legal, technical, and training support for the communities across the South. In recognition for his service to the state of Mississippi, the Chief Justice of Mississippi Supreme Court appointed Mr. Johnson to the Mississippi Access to Justice Commission, and the governor of Mississippi appointed him chair of the Governor's Commission for Recovery, Rebuilding, and Renewal after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. Mr. Johnson founded One Voice Incorporated to improve the quality of life for African Americans through civic engagement training and initiatives, leading the creation of the annual Black Leadership Summit and Mississippi Black Leadership Institute. On October 21st, 2017, the Executive Committee of the NAACP National Board of Directors elected Derrick Johnson President and CEO. Since his election, President Johnson has made it his mission to re-envision and reinvigorate the NAACP. In this past year, Johnson has led the association in the Supreme Court case Trump v. NAACP to successfully block the dismantling of DACA. In addition, Johnson led the campaign Stop Hate for Profit on social media this past summer. In a world where mistakes and differences can cause a polarizing divide, Derrick Johnson recognizes that the path to progress is by unifying a variety of perspectives through education and sharing of diverse experiences. I am truly honored to introduce to our virtual stage someone who inspires me, President and CEO of the NAACP, Derrick Johnson.
Thank you, and I want to thank the Institute for inviting me this morning. And as we all get adjusted to this COVID reality of operating virtually, sometimes it's difficult to give a speech or presentation without what we call in African tradition, the call and a response. So I'm going to do the best that I can in that scenario, just to share a few words, and hopefully the words I share can both encourage and in some situations even inspire. You know, we are living in a unique moment in time. It's a moment in time that if you would ask any of us a year ago, none of us would have been able to predict a reality where a global health pandemic would grip our country in ways in which it almost paralyzed. In addition to that, a day and time where social media has become so advanced, it is capturing what many of us in the African American community have known all too well. There are far too many law enforcement agencies or law enforcement officers who simply lack a level of perspective or integrity or character to treat people who are different than them with dignity and respect, especially African Americans. But character is oftentimes defined as the things you do in the dark when no one is looking. It is not the words you speak, it's not the public actions, it's not what you project in terms of how you would like to see, how you would like to have people see you or perceive you. It is far too often the things that you do just because it is an important thing to do. It is a part of your integrity. It's a part of who you are. It's a part of a value system. And what we have been witnessing over the last several months is the opening up of the things individuals do in spaces they thought was in the dark, but social media has brought it to the light. If you ask many African Americans who live around the country as it relates to their encounters with law enforcement, far too many have had negative encounters. Unfortunately, some of those encounters didn't end up in deaths, but far too many of those encounters ended up in a level of treatment, whether verbally or otherwise, that was unbecoming both of the situation or this principle that all men and women are created equally and endowed with certain inalienable rights. But as we begin to see the character of our law enforcement officers across the country, not all of them, but the ones who have been operating with a level of bias, of discrimination, of racial hatred, that it is jumping off the page and it is appalling to many Americans, not only Blacks, but many Americans. And that's why we were looking at in the midst of this health pandemic, in the midst of this economic downturn, in the midst of a level of uncomfortable unrest, you were seeing peaceful protests across the country, and those protesters look like America. They're Black, they're white, they're young, they're old, male, female. It looked like America because what they are saying is a statement of fact. It's not a hashtag, it's not an organization. It is a statement of fact that Black lives matter. That statement of fact coming from the voices of so many people, Black, white, young, and old, is saying that until we respect the lives of Black people in this country, none of our lives will matter. That the democracy that we are all proud to be a part of is eroding at the seams in ways in which some people wanted to think that we had healed from the past, when in fact, we are revisiting the past. Faulkner had to say that in Mississippi or in general, history is not the past. And I can't even get the quote right, but his point was that until we address the past, we will repeat the history of the past. And if you are in Alabama, I live in Mississippi, we know also well the resistance with addressing the past. The inconsistency of wanting to support through this lens of heritage, a proposition of hate called the Confederacy, is inconsistent with a democratic value proposition that Black lives matter. The fact that you want to uphold statues and symbols that was used as symbols of terror is inconsistent with a democratic principle that we're all endowed with certain inalienable rights and all men and women are created equal. And it is against our patriotic duty to try to be both Confederate and American. It is inconsistent to think that we can wrap around the beautiful language of heritage to justify the values of hatred that was imposed against a community, the community that I come from, the community that so many of us come from. But it is important for all of us to recognize the way and the path to address history is not through hatred. It is through understanding that we all have a journey to go on together. You know, the beautiful example that John Lewis left for us, an ordinary person who did extraordinary things, that if we stand in a level of comfort, we would never be able to progress. That change will cause us to be uncomfortable, it's inconvenient, and will make all of us, Black and white, male and female, to confront some uncomfortable truths. And until we are willing to confront those uncomfortable truths, we cannot progress. That's the beautiful thing that we're seeing with the peaceful protests across the country. Individuals who are not a part of the affected community but understand the effects that is being felt by the community cannot be consistent with upholding a democratic system, and we all are able to prosper from. So in this moment of opportunity, that's what I see it as, a moment of opportunity, that intersecting point of individuals who are in the streets peacefully protesting in the backdrop of others who want to become demagogues or trying to demagogue around issues of fear. In this moment of peaceful protest, where individuals are standing up in ways and in places that none of us expected they would stand up. I have units, the NAACP, in 47 states, and I have seen activities of our members in all 47 states. And in many of those states, those activities were not led by African Americans. It was led by communities across the spectrum that God has made us all to be. Understanding that race is nothing more than a social construct to maintain domination and control over some people to exploit them for cheap and expendable labor. But in this point of opportunity, we can come together as corporations across the country begin to recognize that structural racism must be addressed. In this moment of opportunity of individuals standing up and proclaiming that factual state that Black Lives Matter, in this point that where even Dolly Parton, a famed country singer, who in her remarks, excuse my profanity here, when asked the question, what do you feel about Black Lives Matter? She said, of course, Black Lives Matter. Do you think only our little white asses matter? All of us must stand together to understand that until we respect the quality of life and the dignity of all Americans, we will never have the level of comfort that we all pursue. In this position as NAACP, I've seen that important in my first year and a half when a contract was given by this country to a set of individuals who was brought to this country outside of their control or power. And that contract said that if you was brought here and if you take these steps, we can create a pathway to citizenship. We know that as DACA. And then when we began to look at what was taking place, I quickly could equate that agreement, that contract with individuals to have a pathway, and that contract being reneged on to say, you know what, this is very similar to a Supreme Court case that impacted the African American community. That case being known as Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court at the time said Blacks had no rights, whites were bound to uphold. And it didn't feel comfortable. I can only imagine to many of our ancestors who had to be confronted with if they were able to journey outside of slaveholding territory and establish their freedom, they still lacked any rights that others were bound to uphold. Is that uncomfortable reality that many of our ancestors had to confront when they took up arms and they reinforced Union troops, not because someone was saving them, but they reinforced those Union troops for their liberation. And as a result, we saved the Union. And in saving that, we gained the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, and from there begin to matriculate through society as full functioning and participating citizens, not only through the vote, but through our labor and through commerce. Only to be confronted with a new norm, a new reality that was established through what was called the Black Codes and later Plessy versus Ferguson. And all of a sudden, we were back into a system of being exploited for cheap labor. But all of those things are important to know, not because we want to flaunt it in someone's face or not because we feel as if there is a supremacy of any ethnic group or supremacy of any racial identity, but because if we don't take hold of those historical realities that brought us here today, we cannot move into the future. On last year, we took a delegation of almost 300 people to the country of Ghana to recognize the 400th year of the transatlantic slave trade. And a beautiful opportunity in that moment was when some of the young people who were a part of, that journey back to the motherland for some of us to recognize one of the traditional African symbols, a symbol that you could find in West Africa, a symbol you can find in Southern Africa, a symbol you can find in Eastern Africa. It was a bird flying in air, but looking back. That bird for us is called Sankofa, pressing forward into the future by looking back at the history, being guided by where we know we've come from as we move forward so we don't repeat the same eras of the past. This moment of opportunity gives us that direction. This is our Sankofa moment, a moment where we can take all of what we have experienced in this year of 2020, a year that's kicking off a decade that many of us would never forget, whether it's the health pandemic, the economic downturn, or all of the unfortunate police encounter violences that we have seen. That we learn from the past so we don't repeat the past. We use this moment of opportunity to move closer together to open up a more honest and equitable conversation on how we exist and build and perfect this democracy and not destroy it, and allow demagogues to use language of intolerance and opportunities of division to create chaos. So I want to thank this institute for allowing me this moment to speak. But I also want to give a charge that in this moment of opportunity, we must move from protests in the streets, peaceful protests, to power at the ballot box. And at that ballot box, we must make sure that we walk into those precincts with a value proposition that we must all do to make democracy work. That the language of intolerance and the language of division should not guide our choices. As the NAACP, we're nonprofit. We don't tell people how to vote. We just hope people walk into a ballot box and pull the curtain and do so with a level of character. The thing that you do when no one is looking, to assert a value proposition that constitutional promise that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights is how you cast your vote. That you do it with an understanding that the intolerance and the racial hatred of the past should not guide and drive our future. That you do it with the understanding that we leave the ballot box with a set of policymakers that we have to live with, and they should carry into their seats of power a value proposition. That the constitutional promises that Martin Luther King spoke about 57 years ago yesterday, that the check that African Americans took to the Bank of Justice was returned insufficient funds because those funds of that promise was not delivered at that time, that we can have policymakers who are willing to step up and make sure that check clear, funds are in the bank, that our young people can have a bright future together. that we care for our elderlies and we allow for their lean years and their labor to be respected and they can retire and rest in dignity. And that we protect the rights of all individuals, particularly those who are disadvantaged, however we posture the words disadvantage. It is the mark of a healthy society. Continue to do the work of the Institute and my charges today. Let's operate with character. Let's do the things that we will want done to us. Let's do the thing that we want people to perceive us as. Let's be the bigger persons, Black, white, male, or female, that we need to ensure we perfect this democracy. Thank you for this opportunity.
All right, thank you so much, President Johnson, for sharing with us. We've got a couple of questions coming up in the Q&A. And one is from one of our fellows, Dwyer, who asks, what happens when the ballot boxes are being removed? And I guess we're talking about barriers to voting. And so I want to hear your thoughts on that.
We are confronted with a challenge, and unfortunately, we are going to be faced with many vote suppression tactics. It's going to be narrowly targeted to certain communities and certain populations. African Americans, we are the biggest target of that. That's unfortunate as a part of that negative history that we have to grow out of. We're going to find it on college campuses because in many ways, young people are more forward thinking than others. Therefore, you're going to find it there. But I tell everyone that absent of policy change and or protections, the number one way to overcome vote suppression is voter turnout. And so as we get closer to the election process and the ballot boxes open, whether it's early voting, absentee voting, mail-in voting, or in-person voting on election day, we have to be able to understand the rules of engagement as they evolve, unfortunately. And in some cases, the role of the NAACP and other organizations like ours, we're going to be filing lawsuits to enjoin the obstruction to voting.
Thank you. Another question, what are your recommendations for the upcoming generation of leaders? This is from a student, Francis. Any advice on where to find motivation and how to start making an impact?
You know, when I was an undergrad, fortunately, I went to a school that always had civil rights veterans on the campus. And the thing I learned early on is most, if not all of them, I would say 99.9% of them start with the proposition that we all have the ability to inspire others and to be inspired by others. We all have a responsibility to look more in what I call a community-centric approach and not an egocentric approach. There was no leader of the civil rights movement. You had many people who added their voices and their energies to the movement. And all of them would tell you that the study of past movements was the inspiration, that those who organized what stick, they were inspired by Ella Baker. And Ella Baker was inspired by a generation before her. And all of them studied, whether they were at Fisk with John Lewis and Diane Nash, or at Morehouse with Frank Reed and Julian Bond, or Tougaloo with Lawrence Guion and Hollis Watkins, or Howard with Stokely Carmichael and Charlie Cobb, or you name the school, that they begin to draw strength and inspirations from each other. They draw strength and inspiration from professors who understand the power of social justice movement. They drew strength from learning from past examples, but not allowing anyone among them to demigod as if they were the leader, because there is no such thing. We all have leadership capacities.
Okay. Another question from our fellow John Hammondtree. You touched on the importance of building coalitions for action in the South. Could you expand a little bit on that and maybe talk about how you have been part of that?
In many ways, particularly in Mississippi, we have been dogged by history. We were elated this past June when we finally removed the Confederate symbol from the flag. 1993, I was a part of a group of plaintiffs who sued the state of Mississippi to have that symbol of racial hatred removed from our state flag. And we were successful. We were successful in our arguments because Mississippi had never adopted the symbol, but we were not successful when the legislators came back in late 1998 and adopted a resolution to put the question on a ballot to be voted on in 2001. That was unfortunate. That was unfortunate because the group of plaintiffs were both black and white. And in 2001, I ended up managing the campaign, the referendum for a new flag, and that was unsuccessful. But it also informed me that you can never put up for a vote hate. Had we put up for a vote the ending of slavery, we would still be enslaved. Had we put up for a vote to end segregation, segregation would still exist. Had we put up for a vote to allow black and white children to go to school together, we would have lost each one of those. And so for me, this past June, it was a long journey, but that journey included people from both the black and white community who seized upon the time and was able to maneuver politically to call the question. That movement that led up to June was both Democrats and Republicans, black and white. That actually started in 2015. Perseverance is the goal. Movements are never started by the masses and won. Movements are started by the minority and the masses join in for the victory. And coalitions are built the same way. It may not be everybody in the room at the time, but you have to leave space for people to join the room if they share value alignments.
Okay, thank you. And kind of continuing in that vein, we have a question from Trinity, one of our students. How do you continue to maintain that hope and drive in a world that has been formed from centuries of injustice, where sometimes it seems like one step forward and two steps back?
My hope and drive come from the elders and others around me that I was very intentional to surround myself with. When you are surrounded by people who are driven to ensure that the integrity of our community is respected, that you surround yourself around people who actually have integrity to ensure that all people are treated equally across the board, that when you sit around a table with them, they are as ample to address gender equality as they are racial equality, then you have hope. Because the fight is not about you, the fight is about the future. The fight is about the opportunities that some of us were afforded, but far too many were not afforded, or where some of us were denied, and we want to see future generations afforded opportunities. That's what gives me hope. Understanding that in this marathon, I'm just a steward of this phase. But this phase must be passed on to another generation, and that next generation must inherit something that is stronger than what I inherited. And if they don't, I have failed. But if they do, I have succeeded in this marathon. That's what gives me hope and drive and purpose.
All right. Another question from Kenny, one of our fellows. What is your recommendation on how to translate this message of liberty and equality between votes? So between election cycles. But there's more to do more before and after. How do you translate that?
Well, elections are only transactional. The goal is to have the right policymakers in the seat so you can move the substance of public policy. And it's public policy that's longer standing, albeit fluid, but longer standing. So the goal is not the election. The goal is to impact the formation of public policy to address structural racism, in my point, but equality of all in the broader scope.
Okay. Another question from Phillips about engaging voters who are exhausted or burned out. When some phrases like it's never mean more do not move them.
Well, I tell people when I get this that if you don't get moved, perhaps the economic downturn moved you. If you don't get moved, perhaps the current health realities that we see people are confronted with move you. If you don't get moved, maybe you're okay with the standard and quality of life and the political landscape as you see it. I can't encourage you if what we see around us is what it is. There are no better justifications for getting engaged. One of our key themes is vote, our lives depend on it. That's a literal statement that we are confronted with a health pandemic that's global in scope and we lack a federal response. There is no federal response to a global pandemic for this country. So every country in the industrialized world, their numbers are going down and ours are going up. If that's not encouraging, and if you're African American male and you know that at any given moment you can be threatened by those who are sworn to serve and protect because qualified immunity is in place, therefore they can operate above the law. Or the fact that there is no national database of police misconduct. So even if a law enforcement officer get into an incident at one agency, those records are not carried over to another agency, so they can just pick up and continue terrorizing communities within another jurisdiction. That's not encouraging to you. There's nothing I can say to encourage you. I can only say, vote. Our lives depend on it.
Um, Another question with respect to voter participation, particularly in the South, how can we inspire that participation where some may feel like their vote's not important because states may be dominated by a single party?
Elections are not just federal, elections are local. And when you look at the Ahmaud Arbery incident in Georgia, that district attorney is on the ballot this year. There's now an opponent running against that district attorney. So look at not just the federal elections, look at what's going on locally. Where are the opportunities? But more importantly, the exercise in muscle builds muscle. So whether or not you find that this particular election is not important or you live in a jurisdiction where you don't have impact, exercise the muscle. And if it gets strong enough and enough of you, because enough of you are doing it, it'll be strong enough to really impact the outcome of the elections to reflect the needs and interests of the communities that you come from. You don't stop working out because you don't think you can get strong. You continue to work out so you can get strong.
All right. We have another question. How would you respond to groups of people who have lost faith in the ability of our elected leaders to initiate change that people want to see?
Well, I would say run for office. Identify somebody else who can run you have faith in. You know, this regressive narrative of never know, bad, can't do is self fulfilling. We have to get in front of the narrative and talk about the opportunities. We have to get in front of the narrative and own our responsibility that is not about the transaction of the election, is about the ongoing development and advocacy of an agenda that reflects our needs and interests. And if you find that you're only one, that means you have to go back and double down to get others who feel the same way with you. We have to start with a proactive narrative and lead with a proactive narrative so we can have proactive outcomes.
All right. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have for the Q&A. But I want to give you a last opportunity to just share any closing thoughts that you may have with us, whether it's about NAACP priorities or things of that nature, or anything you would like to share to motivate our students and our community members.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. We are asking people to get involved, be engaged. You can sign up as a volunteer, naacp.org/volunteer. You can join the association. We're a bottom-up organization, not top-down. So it's an opportunity for all of us to do our part. But most importantly, recognize when you honor, you see someone like a John Lewis. Take this to heart. He was an ordinary individual from Troy, Alabama, who was able to do extraordinary things. You have the capacity to also do extraordinary things, even if you don't think you can, because all of us are only ordinary people with that capacity. Lean into your strength. Use the tools and skills and critical thinking ability that you are developing to help others. And if you do that effectively, you would then help society. And once society is helped, we can, in fact, perfect this thing we call a democracy.